We now know what happened that terrible night when Chris Watts slaughtered his beautiful wife and daughters. This is the last video of Shanann returning home from a business trip. It was recorded August 13th, 2018. The timestamp 1:48 a.m.
In the early hours of August the 13th, 2018, a 34-year-old woman named Shanann Watts landed back home in Frederick, Colorado, after a business trip to Arizona. She was 15 weeks pregnant, excited about the son she and her husband were planning to name Nico, and completely unaware that she would never see another sunset. Within 36 hours, she and her two young daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, would be missing, and their own husband and father would be standing in front of television cameras, tearfully begging for their safe return, telling reporters and viewers across the country that he just wanted his family home safe. He knew exactly where they were the entire time he was making that plea. What makes this case so genuinely disturbing isn't just what Chris Watts eventually admitted to doing inside that house, a case that would go on to draw intense national attention because of the stark contrast between the family's curated social media life and the brutality of what actually happened behind closed doors. It's how many times his story changed before he ever told the truth, and how far he was willing to go, even in his own confession, to make sure the blame for what happened to his daughters didn't land entirely on him. Before we get into what happened, if you're new here, hit subscribe now. Every case on this channel is based on court records, official documents, and verified reporting, never rumors or speculation. If you enjoy fact-based true crime, you're in the right place. And if this story already has your attention, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Chris Watts and Shanann Watts met on Facebook in 2010 and married 2 years later, in Charlotte, North Carolina, in November of 2012. The two of them eventually relocated to Frederick, Colorado, a quiet suburb north of Denver, where they bought a 5-bedroom house worth roughly $400,000. On the surface, and especially across Shannon's heavily curated social media presence, the Watts family looked like the picture of suburban success, the kind of family whose photos, filled with matching outfits, warm smiles, and carefully staged milestones, gave absolutely no outward indication of the strain building underneath. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, an oil and gas company. Shanann built a career as a sales representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing wellness company, regularly posting glowing updates about her family, her marriage, and her products to a large online following that had come to know her as an upbeat, devoted wife and mother. They had 2 daughters together, Bella, born in 2013, and Celeste, born in 2015. Underneath that curated image, though, the family was under serious financial strain. Back in 2015, the Watts had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection, listing liabilities of nearly $450,000 against a combined household income of only around $100,000. It's the kind of gap between appearance and reality that, in hindsight, so many of these cases seem to share. A family projecting stability and success to the outside world while quietly buckling under pressure no one else could see. To anyone scrolling through Shannon's social media feed in the months before August of 2018, none of that financial pressure would have been visible at all. Just a steady stream of family photos, product promotions, and the kind of polished, aspirational content that made the eventual revelations about what was really happening inside that house feel even more jarring by comparison. What almost none of that outside world knew was that Chris Watts had, for some time, been carrying on a secret and increasingly serious affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. Kessinger herself would later tell investigators she had no idea Watts was still married when their relationship began, and once she learned the truth about what he'd actually done, she cooperated extensively with police, providing information that became genuinely important to the investigation against him. For Chris, according to what prosecutors would later lay out, the affair represented something he wanted desperately: a fresh start, one free of the debt, the pressure, and the domestic obligations that came with being a husband and a father of two, soon to be three. It's worth pausing on just how deliberately Chris kept those two worlds separate right up until the very end. Kessinger has said publicly that she believed she was building a genuine future with a man she understood to be either divorced or in the process of separating, entirely unaware that the family he described leaving behind was, at that exact moment, still very much intact, still living under the same roof, still completely unaware that their husband and father had already begun planning an exit that had nothing to do with divorce papers at all. On the morning of August the 13th, 2018, Shanann arrived home from her trip to Arizona at around 1:50 in the morning, dropped off by her friend and coworker, Nicole Atkinson. According to what Chris later told investigators, sometime around 5 that morning, he told Shanann he wanted to separate. He described the conversation as emotional but civil, saying the two of them were both upset and crying, but that there was no argument. He then left for work at his usual time, roughly 5:30, and by his own account, simply carried on with his day as though nothing unusual had happened. Later that day, Shanann and the girls stopped responding to messages entirely. Nicole Atkinson, growing increasingly worried, especially after Shanann missed an important prenatal appointment, drove to the Watts home and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. Atkinson called Chris at work, and she also called the Frederick Police Department to request a welfare check. When officers arrived and Chris returned home to meet them, he gave them permission to search the house. What they found inside only deepened the unease. Shannon's purse was still there, her car keys and phone sitting inside it, and according to Atkinson, Shanann would never have left the house without that purse, since it contained the medication she needed for her lupus. Her car was parked in the garage. Her wedding ring was resting on the couple's bed. Every detail pointed toward a woman who hadn't left voluntarily, and by the next day, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were all officially declared missing, with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation issuing endangered missing person alerts for all three of them. For a friend like Atkinson, someone who knew Shannon's daily habits well enough to recognize instantly that leaving her purse and medication behind simply wasn't something she would ever do voluntarily. Those small domestic details were the first real signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside a house that, from the street, looked exactly the same as it always had. As the investigation expanded, with the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation joining local police, Chris Watts gave repeated interviews, including several in front of television cameras, in which he pleaded publicly for his family's safe return. He maintained he had last seen Shanann at around 5:15 that morning before leaving for work, and he denied, when directly asked, that he was involved in any kind of extramarital affair. That denial didn't hold up for long. As investigators worked through his phone records, they uncovered clear evidence of his relationship with Nicole Kessinger, evidence that immediately made him a far more serious focus of the investigation, particularly once it became obvious he'd lied about it directly to officers working a missing persons case involving his own pregnant wife and children. On August the 15th, investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph examination. He agreed, and over the course of an interview process that stretched across roughly 7 hours, he answered a series of direct, carefully worded questions about whether he had physically caused his wife's disappearance. At one point, an investigator asked him plainly whether he could pass the test if asked whether he had physically caused Shannon's disappearance, and Chris answered that he believed he could. He failed the test badly, scoring what investigators described as one of the lowest possible results. Confronted with that failure, Chris asked to speak with his father before saying anything further. After that conversation, he began to talk. What followed was the first of several shifting accounts Chris Watts would give investigators over the following hours, each one inching closer to the truth while still working hard to shift blame away from himself. In his initial confession, Chris claimed that after he told Shanann he wanted to separate that morning, he walked downstairs, leaving her alone in their bedroom. When he returned, he said, he checked a baby monitor sitting on Shannon's nightstand and saw her, through the monitor, actively strangling their youngest daughter, Celeste, while their older daughter, Bella, lay motionless and already appearing blue on her own bed nearby. According to this version of events, Chris said he then flew into a rage upon witnessing what he believed was his wife murdering their children, and in that rage, he strangled Shanann to death himself. That detail, a baby monitor supposedly showing him the unimaginable image of his own wife killing their daughters, was specific enough and disturbing enough that for a period it genuinely shaped how investigators approached the rest of the case, even as physical evidence continued to accumulate in the background that would eventually prove none of it had happened that way at all. It was a version of events almost perfectly engineered to cast Chris as a man reacting to unbearable horror rather than as the person who had actually killed all three of them. And for a period, investigators had to seriously grapple with the possibility that some twisted version of it might be true. But it didn't hold together for long. As investigators continued questioning him and confronted him with mounting physical evidence that simply didn't fit his account, Chris's story began to collapse. Eventually, he admitted the truth in full. He had strangled Shanann to death himself, and he alone had smothered both Bella and Celeste, using a blanket in order to eliminate any witnesses to what he had already done to their mother. Chris then led investigators to where he had taken all three bodies, a remote oil production site belonging to Anadarko Petroleum, the same company he worked for, a location he would have had intimate familiarity with through his job. He had buried Shannon's body, along with the unborn son she'd been carrying, in a shallow grave near the tank site. Bella and Celeste, meanwhile, had been hidden separately, their small bodies placed inside two different crude oil storage tanks on the property. On August the 16th, investigators recovered all three. Shannon's body was found in the shallow grave and pronounced dead just after 5 in the morning. Celeste's body was recovered from inside one of the oil tanks later that afternoon, at around 3:40. Bella's body was recovered from a separate tank that evening, at around 5:50. Chris Watts was fired from Anadarko Petroleum the day after his arrest. Before Chris had even confessed, investigators had already picked up on a critical clue pointing toward that exact location. A drone search of the surrounding fields had spotted a bedsheet lying in the open near the tank farm, one that matched pillowcases and a top sheet later found discarded in the trash outside the Watts family home, along with what officers described in the arrest affidavit as fresh movement of dirt consistent with a clandestine grave near the tanks. On August the 21st, 2018, prosecutors formally charged Chris Watts with 9 felony counts. That included 5 separate counts of first-degree murder, with 2 counts for each of his daughters individually, reflecting Colorado law's treatment of the murder of a child under 12 by someone in a position of trust, alongside a single count for Shannon's murder. He was also charged with unlawful termination of a pregnancy in connection with the death of his unborn son Nico, and 3 separate counts of tampering with a deceased human body, covering his transportation and concealment of all 3 victims at the oil site. He was initially held without the ability to post the $5 million bail set in his case. The case moved toward trial with the possibility of the death penalty technically on the table, since first-degree murder in Colorado could, at that time, carry a capital sentence. But Shannon's own family made their wishes known to prosecutors directly. According to reporting on the case, they made clear they didn't want another killing carried out in their daughter's name, regardless of what Chris Watts had done. Respecting that wish, prosecutors and Watts's defense team reached a plea agreement that took execution off the table entirely. It's a decision that speaks to something larger than legal strategy alone, a grieving family choosing, in the immediate aftermath of losing 3 members of their own household in the most violent way imaginable, not to pursue the one form of punishment that might have felt like the most direct kind of justice, out of a conviction that no further death, even his, would bring any of them back. On November the 6th, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 charges against him. Roughly 2 weeks later, on November the 19th, he was formally sentenced. The court handed down 5 separate life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 of them running consecutively and 2 running concurrently, guaranteeing he would never be eligible for release under any circumstance. On top of those life sentences, he received an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and another 36 years for tampering with the bodies of his wife and daughters. Immediately after sentencing, his previous $5 million bail was revoked, and he was taken into custody on the spot. He has since been held at a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, transferred there specifically because Colorado authorities determined he required housing outside the state given the extraordinary level of public attention and threat his case attracted. The decision to move him out of Colorado's own prison system entirely underscores just how unusual the surrounding circumstances of this case became, a level of notoriety significant enough that even his day-to-day incarceration required special handling, well beyond what a typical life sentence case would call for. In a follow-up interview with investigators that stretched across roughly 5 hours, conducted sometime after his initial confession, Chris offered yet another, more complete account of what had actually happened inside the house that morning, one that went even further than his earlier admission. He described strangling Shanann after the 2 of them argued about his desire to separate. While he was in the process of attempting to move her body downstairs, he said, the girls woke up and saw him, having apparently witnessed at least part of what he'd already done to their mother. According to this account, it was only after that moment that he made the decision to kill both girls individually, smothering each of them one at a time using a blanket he had in his truck, before loading all 3 bodies into that same truck and driving them to the oil site where he ultimately disposed of them. This final account removed entirely the fabricated image of Shanann as a killer, the baby monitor, the strangled child, the rage-filled husband reacting to horror rather than committing it, replacing it instead with a version in which Chris was the only person in that house who had killed anyone at all, and in which his own daughters had been alive, awake, and aware of what was happening in the moments before he decided they, too, had to die. The gap between Chris Watts's first confession, in which he cast himself as a horrified witness reacting in a single moment of rage to his wife's supposed murder of their children, and his final account, in which he alone was responsible for strangling Shanann, and then separately, deliberately smothering 2 fully conscious young girls who had just witnessed something no child should ever see, remains one of the most chilling details of the entire case. It wasn't a story that fell apart because of some single dramatic piece of evidence. It fell apart piece by piece, under sustained, methodical questioning, exactly the way investigators are trained to slowly dismantle an account built on self-preservation rather than truth. In the years since the case concluded, it has become the subject of extensive media coverage, including a Lifetime television film released in January of 2020 that Shannon's own parents, Frank and Sandra Arzusek, publicly criticized, saying they were never consulted during its production and hadn't even known about it until filming was already underway. They argued the film contained inaccuracies and expressed concern it would fuel further online harassment directed at their family. Harassment, they said, had already been ongoing since Shannon's murder first made national headlines. Later that same year, in September of 2020, Netflix released a documentary built around home videos, text messages, and social media posts pulled directly from the family's own digital footprint, offering what many viewers described as an especially unsettling look at just how ordinary and happy the Watts family had appeared to the outside world, right up until the moment it wasn't. Additional dramatizations and documentaries have continued to appear in the years since, a reflection of just how enduring the public fascination with this case has remained, even years after Chris Watts was already locked away for the rest of his life. What continues to make this case so difficult to fully process isn't simply the scale of the violence: a pregnant woman and two small children, killed by the one person who should have protected them above anyone else. It's the composure Chris Watts displayed throughout nearly every stage of the unfolding tragedy, giving tearful television interviews pleading for his family's safe return, while knowing exactly where their bodies were the entire time. And then, even once cornered by failed polygraph results and mounting physical evidence, still reaching first for a version of events that shifted the blame for his daughter's deaths onto the wife he had already strangled to death himself. It was only under the full weight of continued investigation that the truth Chris Watts had been so carefully constructing around himself finally, completely, gave way, leaving behind a case that, years later, still stands as one of the starkest examples of the distance that can exist between a family's public image and the reality quietly unfolding behind their own front door. If you found this case interesting, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next true crime story.